So if you look on your chart, if you take out your overall chart that I gave you, okay? So our key 11 books are down there along the bottom. We have Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, okay? 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and Ezra and Nehemiah. Those are the books of restoration. So that's the final era, if you will, of the Old Testament history. So those two books cover the return of the nation, if you will, the remnant of the nation, the return of them back to Jerusalem. And basically there was a three-phase deportation or exile that happened. And in your dating, you have on your chronology of the Old Testament, the first phase, they went out in 722 BC. That was the Assyrian captivity. And then we have the Babylonian captivity that starts in 605 BC, then in 597 as another phase, and then 586. Well, there was a threefold return as well, coming back to Jerusalem. And Ezra and Nehemiah are the second and third phase, if you will, of return. The first was under Zerubbabel. And you'll notice in your chronology of the Old Testament also that there is a span of dating for Isaiah and his prophecies, Jeremiah and his prophecies, and then Ezekiel, is because they covered such a broad range of time. Basically, 4 kings were covered in the period of Isaiah's ministry. So I'll just give you that heads up there. So anyway, this is a good chart to keep along with the other two to give you a good sense of what's going on in the Old Testament. And then when you get to the particular books, then you can use the background material. We're going to continue in Numbers, but I wanted to introduce to you to Deuteronomy. We'll go there next week. But I give you the outline on Deuteronomy, and you have 2 examples. And on your outline for Deuteronomy that I handed out, the first outline, you have the first discourse, second discourse, third discourse, historical appendix. I refer to them as sermons, and basically they're extemporaneous sermons. I mean, that's essentially what they were. Some say, huh?
What's that big word mean?
Yeah, sort of like, if you do like a expository message, you go through and you've outlined and you've ordered your thoughts and everything's nice and concise and you have your points, subpoints, and so on. Extemporaneous is more of just sort of going off the cuff a little bit. And so it's not as structured. There is an element of structure to Deuteronomy, but nonetheless. And they cover the different periods. So you have the first sermon that Moses gives is looking backwards. The second is looking ahead. And then the last one, if you will, looking up, or if we put it past, present, future. So we'll look at that next week. And you got the key chapters, key passages for Deuteronomy. And then I give you the background intro material. So under title there, Deuteronomy, Moses' Upper Desert Discourse, consists of 3 farewell sermons by their 120-year-old leader. It is addressed to the new generation, those who had survived the wilderness wandering, prepared to enter in and take possession of the land of promise. And like Leviticus, Deuteronomy contains a large amount of legal detail, but the emphasis is more on the people and not so much on the priests. And Moses is going to remind the next generation, new generation, of the disobedience and the need for obedience as they go in to possess the land. I give you the Hebrew title there for Deuteronomy, and again, it's taken off the first 2 words of chapter 1, verse 1. These are the words. Deuteronomy has been called the 5/5 of the law since it completes the 5 books of Moses. The Jewish people have called it the Mishneh HaTorah, and they translate a repetition of the law, really copy of the law, if you will. There's a mistranslation by the Septuagint, and essentially that's what led to our title for it, but there's a mistranslation by the Septuagint of that particular statement in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 18, and they translated this second law, and it's really not this second law, it is the repetition or the copy of the law, because Deuteronomy isn't essentially a second law that is given other than, the law at Mount Sinai. Basically, it is an explanation or a recitation of that, or if you will. Also, it's been referred to as the Book of Remembrance, which is a very appropriate title for Deuteronomy. So that is your background and setting, and we'll get into that next week, but just so we stay ahead of ourselves and keep this train moving. I wanted to spend time in Deuteronomy because I think it's important, because we have to deal with the issue of the covenant, Abrahamic covenant. We have an extension of that covenant in Deuteronomy, so we are going to take the time to go through there, and then the other books we will start to sort of move together a little bit more rapidly. So, Book of Numbers, if you turn there with me, and we'll review a little bit, and then we'll get into the heart of where the book is tonight. I have some really great shots of the geography of this area, so it's kind of cool. I also have some of Mount Nebo, but we'll look at those next week. That was where Moses got his purview of the land before he passed away. But Israel's covered a great bit of ground thus far, getting from Egypt to Sinai. They park it at Sinai for a while, and there they need to be set in order. Everything needs to be straightened out, which we looked at last week. We talked about the issue of the fact of order, disorder, and then reorder, if you want to go that way through the flow of Deuteronomy, and really that is a sort of a fitting flow for the book, because essentially that's how it starts off, and then we have the period of transition, the disorder, the period of disobedience, and then the reorder that comes when we have the second census is given in the end of the book, and then the new generation preparing themselves, and we'll find them at the precipice, or if you will, on the east side of the Jordan River, ready to enter into the promised land, or the land of promise. And Moses is going to challenge them, and we'll see that there's an affirmation of the fact that Moses really does think that they're going to go in, that they are not going to fail before entering the land. But we talked about the experience of the first generation in the wilderness, 1:1 through 25:18, the obedience of Israel toward the Lord, 1:1 through 10:36. And I thought this was important because oftentimes when you come to the book of Numbers, we talk about the issue of faithlessness and disobedience, and that is, yes, that is sort of the note that's struck from the middle of the book on, but nonetheless, it starts off with a positive note. And I looked at last week of all the different occurrences in which the Lord spoke to Moses, Moses spoke to the people, and then Moses and the people were obedient to what God said. And over we find this in the first few chapters as God is preparing them to march in to take over the promised land, or land of promise. I find it interesting. So my father was teaching through Hebrews sometime back, and he said, you know, the only place in the Bible where it's referred to as the land of promise is Hebrews. We refer to it as the promised land, or we also refer to it as the Holy Land. But do you realize the only place it's referred to as the Holy Land is Zechariah, and that's after the purification of the land? So essentially, it's not even the Holy Land yet, right? But it's interesting that we use these designations and so frequently and so often, and yet we're not necessarily sure why we're using them in the appropriate way. But nonetheless, here we have the organization of Israel around the tabernacle of the Lord, and this was crucial. This was important for them because everything had to do with that. And later on we see with the issue of the moving of the ark and so on, and that was related to the tabernacle. As long as they were oriented around the Lord properly and oriented toward the Lord properly, and that is reflected in the tabernacle and the ark, then they would have, if you will, victory over their enemies. And so this was crucial for them to understand. God was going to come and reside in their midst. This was His tent in the midst of their tents, which is such a great picture that John picks up on in John chapter 1, right? That He came and tabernacled among us. So unfortunate, really, with John 1, I think, in so many ways, the ways that we have, but it's been translated. Like, the Word was with God. Pros, literally, it was face to face with God. There's so much great truth, theological truth, just in that one preposition, and we just simply translate it with because we want it to be readable or whatever other reasons we choose for. But nonetheless, we miss so much stuff that's there. And even when you look at John's gospel, he's going to build off of those statements from the first 18 verses of chapter 1. But also the fact that he tabernacled among us, we translated dwelt, and unfortunate. But nonetheless, this is where we are. This is the tabernacle, the altar, the laver. When we walk into the tent, what do we see? 3 things when we walk in the door. What were they?
Table of showbread.
Table of showbread.
Holy place. Holy of holies.
Candlestick.
The candlestick, good. And then the ark goes into the Holy of Holies. It's such a great thought. I always have to stop and remind myself of this fact. In the New Testament, when they use the word hieron, the Greek term, they would use it in reference to the whole precinct, the whole temple precinct, everything, right? Court of the women, court of the Gentiles, everything. They would refer to as the hieron. But if they wanted to talk about the Holy of Holies, they would use naos. And it's interesting to me that in Ephesians, we're not the hieron, we are the naos, in which the Spirit of God dwells. That's such a such a powerful thing. But see, if you don't have that Old Testament background, right, and those things in your mind, and even the more contemporary version of the temple that Herod had built, right, in the days of Paul, when he talks about the barrier being torn down and all that stuff, and not knowing those things, the punch of Ephesians chapter 2 kind of comes up a little limp for us, right, if we don't know these things. But knowing them, it's such a powerful truth. So we have the census of the first generation that takes place in chapter 1, and essentially it is for the men for warfare. In verse 3 it says, from 20 years old and upward, whoever is able to go out to war in Israel, you and Aaron shall number them by their armies. And so this was in a preparation for war. Then they had the encampment around the tabernacle, chapter 2, verses 1 through 34. We started our viewing of it starting in chapter 3 with the Levites. We have the Gershonites, the Kohathites, the Merarites, and then we have Moses, Aaron, and the rest of the priests. And then we have the people then ordered around Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, so on, around the tent as God had established them. And then God had a place for, if you will, the mixed multitude. Now it's interesting because they're going to be referenced in Numbers as the rabble, right? The rabble. They're stirring up trouble in Numbers chapter 11. And they're also referred to as the strangers, the sojourners, and so on. But these are that mixed multitude that came up out of Egypt during the time of the Exodus and left with the nation of Israel. So this is essentially what it would have probably looked like, and we'll see some shots of the wilderness where they were, and it was pretty expansive. There was a lot of space. I mean, some think, well, so many people, how could they find place to camp and so on? But there was place for them to reside. But this is how they would order themselves, in, if you will, in the tabernacle in the midst of them, their tent of meeting. You know what's interesting? Just a thought. And I'm not going to elaborate on it, but just a thought. We have reference to the tent of meeting going into the tent, Moses, before the tabernacle was ever built. Think about that one. Was there another tent that was utilized by Moses to go in, and God spoke to him until the tabernacle was built, and then God's Shekinah glory came and resided there in the cloud? Just a thought. So we had marching orders to the tribes, given specific instructions as how they were to march out, as they were to move camp, as the cloud would lift from over the tabernacle and move, the nation knew then it's time to pick up a move and to head off and to go. So we have the disobedience of Israel toward the Lord, chapter 11, 1 through 25, 18. So if you want to turn there with me, we're going to look at that this evening. And it essentially does not take them very long in their trek before there is some problems. But starting in chapter 11, verse 1, all the way through 25:18, this is the first generation, if you will, the generation of the Exodus. And then you're going to have the next generation, the census taken in chapter 26, and then the preparation of them for going in to take possession of the land. But this is where the rebellion begins, and the rebellion of the faithless Israel. And I reflect this in the outline as we go through these major sections. I want to focus on, if you will, the rebellion, the judgment that comes in light of that, and so on, and also what was the rebellion against. But you have the rebellion of faithless Israel in chapter 11, 1 through 21:35. So first we have the complaint and the judgment, blindness towards God's provision. And the people began to complain in chapter 11. Now the people began like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire dried up. So the name of that place was called Taberah, which because of the fire by the Lord burned among them. Now it's interesting because then you're going to have the rising up of Korah and the others. And what happened in that uprising of Korah and the others? What kind of judgment came?
And all the sons died.
And what kind of judgment came? How did God deal with them? So in this case we have fire. What happened with Korah and the uprising? How were they judged? The earth swallowed them up. Plus we also have reference to fire again. It's amazing that and then the uprising of Korah comes after this, right? So you would think that, look, if you understand what God's going to do to those who complain and grumble, you would think you would learn your lesson after fire comes and consumes people. Like, I'm not going to complain. I'm not going to go against the Lord. I'm not going to go against his leadership. I'm not going to attack. I'm just going to keep my mouth shut, and I'm going to do whatever the Lord wants. But yet they don't seem to learn a lesson. And so we have this continual complaint and judgment that comes by God. So blindness towards God's provision in chapter 1, verses 1 through 35. And in the midst of this, and starting in verse 10 through verse 15, is Moses complaining to God, reaching out to God, saying, I can't handle this anymore. And he says in verse 14, I alone am not able to carry all this people because it is too burdensome for me. So if you are going to deal thus with me, please kill me at once, if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness. Moses is saying, I can't handle all these people, all this complaining. And this wasn't the first time complaining started. If you go all the way back, and God makes reference to the fact that their complaining started all the way back in Exodus, right? Well, we should go back to Egypt. Why did you bring us out to the wilderness to die, right? Our pots were full of meat and da-da-da-da-da. And so the complaining started as soon as they headed out of Egypt and came into the wilderness. And it continues on and persists and grows worse. So we have complaint again and judgment, blindness towards God's prophets. So first we have blindness towards God's provision. And in that context, we have in chapter 11, God's provision. He's going to bring the plague of the quail in verse 31 through 35 because they complain. And so therefore God is going to send this. But in chapter 12, then we have the murmuring of Miriam and Aaron. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke, 12:1, against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. For he had married a Cushite woman, and for they had said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, you three come out to the tent of meeting. So the three of them went out, and the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud, and he stood at the doorway of the tent, and he called Aaron and Miriam. And when they had come forward, he said, and he pronounces his judgment on them, hear my words. So over and over we're going to see this constant refrain of complaint and judgment, complaint and judgment, complaint and judgment. So what was interesting is that in the beginning part of Numbers we have references to God's instruction, the obedience of Moses and the people. Now all of a sudden we have this series of complaint and judgment that comes upon them. First in regards to God's provision, next in regards to God's prophet. And it's amazing to see. I mean, God had already provided for them so abundantly. I mean, the Red Sea crossing and all of that. But it just shows how blinded we can be. How often we, even in our own lives, forget how God has made provision for us. And then when the next difficult time comes and we start to panic and we become anxious and what have you, we forget of all the times before that God has stepped in and provided for us so graciously. But these were direct attacks, we'll find. They were direct attacks against God's leadership and then against God himself. In chapter 13, verse 1, we have the spies are going to be sent into the land of Canaan, and this is blindness towards God's power. And this is the major turning point, if you will, in regards to Numbers. And this is the disobedience, if you will, of the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea. Notice with me chapter 13, verse 1, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send out for yourself men so that they may spy out the land of Canaan, which I am going to give to the sons of Israel. You shall send a man from each tribe, their fathers' tribes, every one a leader among them. So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran and commanded them according to the Lord. And so they sent out the spies. How many spies did he send out? Do we know? How many spies did he send out? 12. So he's going to draw from each of the tribes, right, so on, from the headship. So he's going to send out 12 spies to go in the land. They're going to go in and spy out the land for how many days? 40 days, right? And so the judgment is going to be based on the amount of time they spend in there spying out the land. So we have the encampment, if you will, as we enter into chapters 13 and 14. They come in chapter 12 or 16, gets us an indication as where they were afterward. However, the people moved out from Hazeroth and they camped in the wilderness of Paran. And in chapter 13, verse 3, again, we find them there in the wilderness of Paran. And so this is where they came to camp. So the tribes of Israel, they reached the wilderness of Paran, where they camped for some time at the great oasis of Kadesh, chapter 12, verse 26. Kadesh is technically the wilderness of Zin, is here located in the wilderness of Paran, because Zin is a subdivision of the great wilderness. So essentially, if we look at the territory, this is all of it, and we have the desert of Paran, but it's divided up into different, if you will, segments, but it's all technically referred to as the wilderness of Paran. So this is the desert of Zin, and so we have reference to that. And this is a better indication of it. So here's the wilderness of Paran, and we have the wilderness of Shur up here to the left, and then the wilderness of Zin. So all of this, again, if you will, are just subdivisions of this one great wilderness, Paran. And then we have Kadesh Barnea, which is where they are set up to enter into the land. So it would seem that this is where they were going to enter into Canaan and take over possession of the land. They had no intention of going up to the east side of the Jordan River and crossing over there towards Jericho, and that comes later, after, if you will, the second generation and what have you. But it would seem that this is where they intended on entering into the promised land to take it over. And these are shots of the region of the wilderness of Paran. So you can see from one sense why they were, complaining or looking for water. It wasn't like there were rivers everywhere, right? But how amazing it was that God would cause water to come forth from a rock, right? And so we can see somewhat the sense of the situation, the circumstances they were in, why they would be worried about food, why they'd be worried about water. But at the same time, right, they had so much history up to this point already of God's provision from the time of the Exodus, right, to this time. They had enough information about God to not be anxious, to not complain, to rest in faith and trust that He was going to provide for them. Another shot of the territory. And then the other thing is interesting is when you look at the surrounding region, right, and the reference to the fact that the soles of their shoes never wore out in the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and this is the majority of the terrain was a lot like this. I mean, again, even in their discipline, God was still gracious to them, wasn't He? And merciful. He still provided and kept them, preserved them.
Oh, Steve.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
When he sent them out for the 12 to check it out, he was okay with that, the Lord, well, obviously, but when they went out before, remember, to see what the kind of people that they had to, why was he upset with that? They have to deal with these kind of people.
This is the first time He sends them into the land to check it out. And He wanted them to go see, and this was by God's instruction. He commanded Moses, you pick these men, send them out to go out. They come back and they refuse to go into the land. They're afraid, right? We have, descendants of Nephilim, so on. We have these great giants who are there.
Right.
Moses pronounces God's judgment on them. Okay, fine. Your punishment is you're not going to enter the land. Your children are. You're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Then they're going to decide, let's just go up, right? Let's go ahead and do this. We don't want to wander in the wilderness. Well, then they go up and they suffer defeat. And that's the next time that they go in.
Okay.
So this is the wilderness of Paran, in which they would have journeyed in, heading up in towards Kadesh Barnea. This is a nice little signpost by Kadesh Barnea. This is such an amazing thing, right? I mean, we're not talking about... It's like if you read the Book of Mormon, there's a lot of these quote-unquote historical things referenced. It's just fiction. All of it fiction. The amazing thing about the Bible is that you can go to these places, right, and see where this actually took place. We have such a foundation of history that there's no question as to what we have recorded here. I graduated. It's interesting because I was searching the web just a few months back, and I saw a friend of mine that I had went to seminary with. He and I graduated at the same time, and he is living in Israel. And it was fascinating because in chapel, our last chapel as seniors, we were asked to come and speak and share about things we learned. And so they asked us to also tell where we were heading after we finished seminary. So he was sharing how he was going over to Israel, and he said, I'll give you my address of where I'm going to live. And so he walked the Old Testament and gave us basically the geographical location of where he was going to live. And so I was searching the web a few months ago and found him, and there he was. Same place, hasn't budged. But amazing stuff. So this is where we find the nation of Israel, Kadesh. They are going to send the spies, and they're going to go in and search out the land. And they have their walking orders, if you will, the route that they were to be taking. North of Kadesh was the Negev, if you will. This was the hill country, and literally Negev just means the south. So this refers to all the desert southern region of Canaan, and this is where they're going to begin their journey. The hill country consists of the mountains of Judah, north to the hills of Ephraim, and all the way to the heights of Galilee. So essentially, if we look on our map, this is the Negev right here, if you will. So it's just below just below the sea here. This is where they're going to set out, and they're going to journey way up into the northern part, and they're going to loop back around and come back in again. So they're going to get a good view of the land, and they're going to give a good understanding of the people who lived there and what was there. And obviously they did, because they came back a little bit disheartened about what they saw. So this is the Negev, the southern region, if you will. Then, yes?
So your friend that is over there, that went there after seminary,
Yes.
is he there as a missionary?
He went there to teach in an institute. They have an institute there where you can go from, like, students from Master Seminary. We could go there and take electives towards our degree. And so you could study in a kibbutz and live there and travel the region and all of that as far as what you were allowed to travel. So he was a professor there.
Okay. So
He would go under missionary status, but he was a teacher there at an institute.
so that land that he lives in, is that primarily just a Jewish land, or of religions where he lives?
Yes, where he lived, yes. He's just surrounded by those who are from Judaism, if you will. But we'll see some pictures. There's the areas of conflict, and we'll look at Hebron and where it sits. It's very fascinating. First place that David established his kingdom. Later, when it was united, he then established his kingdom in Jerusalem after he drove out the Jebusites. But before that was in Hebron. And that was his first, if you will, capital city. So the inhabitants of the regions, chapter 13, verse 29, given an indication of who's there. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea, by the side of the Jordan. There's a lot I could talk about here. It's amazing to me because we know that they are descendants of who, essentially? From Genesis. Who would they be descendants of? Go back to Noah and his 3 sons. The judgment was placed on who? The curse was placed on Ham. So these are the descendants of Ham, right, who are going to live in this land. But it's interesting because it wasn't like they all automatically, after the Tower of Babel, migrated to Canaan.
How do you know that?
Because we can trace the history of them.
Okay.
We have a lot of data as far as their movements in that. This is one of the things for me. It's interesting. We get to the Hittites, but they are actually an Indo-European people. And they are actually the oldest Indo-European family, if you will, if we talk about the family of language and so on. So when I would teach Greek, I would teach it from a linguistical, historical perspective. But the best copies that we have of the Indo-European language and works are in Sanskrit. But the Hittites are, if you will, the oldest group in that family, but they're all related. So it's interesting because sometimes we think that when you come to the land of Canaan, you have all these different people groups there, that there's such dissimilarity between all of them, and not necessarily so. But we can trace their movements and how they settled, and also the influence on language and so on. And essentially it's been suggested by many scholars, as far as linguists go, who are not even believers, that we could actually, if we had all the information necessary, we could actually trace everything back to that one first original language. Because there was confusion, but I don't think all of it was completely distorted. In other words, I think that there were still some similarities, and we can see that when we start looking at the relationships of different languages, even in the progression. We can see the relationship between Greek, Spanish, Latin, and so on, and we can start to see a parent language behind those, and the parent language behind that, and so on, and we can keep tracing it back and back. So we have the Canaanites. Canaanites were the indigenous population of Canaan. There's a lot of history here, but I just introduce you just generally overview. The Amorites had entered Canaan from the northeast, Aram or Syria, sometime around 2000 BC, and they'd driven the Canaanites out of the hill country, and that is where they themselves settled. We have the Hittites. Hittites originated in central Anatolia, which is modern Turkey, about 1800 BC, and they slowly spread south and southeast. The Jebusites, then, little is known about them really, but we know were settled in Jerusalem, and they were there before anyone else arrived. And so Jerusalem was a place. I mean, David wasn't the one who made Jerusalem a place, but nonetheless he made it the place by the fact that he established this was the seat of his kingdom. But they remained in control of Jerusalem till 400 years after Moses, when David drove them out, captured the city, and made it his capital in 1004 BC. And we find that in 2 Samuel 5, 6 through 10. So, and this is then where, Jerusalem then is the place, right? From here on out, everyone is going up to Jerusalem. So we have like the Psalms of Ascent, which I believe are songs that were sung in the Psalter as they would journey and pilgrim from farther out regions as they would journey towards Jerusalem for the three main festivals that they were supposed to go and celebrate in Jerusalem, that they would journey there. And it was always they were heading up, and so that's why the title is the Psalms of Ascent, as they would ascend, if you will, to the capital. In the New Testament, right, it's always that, going up to Jerusalem, right? So the itinerary of the spies is given in 21 through 24 of chapter 13. So they went up and they spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob at Lebo-Hamath. And when they had gone up into the Negev, they came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were. Now Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt, and then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and from there they cut down the branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it in a pole between two men, with some of the pomegranates and the figs. And they came down, and they called the valley Eshcol, if you will, because of the cluster of which the sons of Israel had drawn from there. So this is basically their itinerary. As they go into the land, they're going to head from the wilderness of Zin north to Rehob to Lebo-Hamath. And probably this is in modern day, it's Leboa, 14 miles northwest of Baalbek, if you will. Hamath was an important Aramean city in the great central valley known as Becca. Lebo-Hamath was at the lower part of that valley and began just north of the Sea of Galilee. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt, and this is interesting because Zoan was also known as Tanis. It was built by the Hyksos. This was the place in which they ruled when they took over control of Egypt and northeastern Egypt. But it's interesting because there's also then stelae that they had taken and moved from Tanis elsewhere in Egypt, and it records for us. And that's how we come to understand as far as dates and different things that took place. Later become Caleb's inheritance. We find this in Joshua 14, 13 through 15. Later, David's capital reigned over Judah in 2 Samuel 2, 1 through 4. So this was his first capital, and then Jerusalem became his second capital. And Hebron is right here near the Sea of Galilee, if you will, and this is situated in modern day, if you will. So we have the West Bank, which we hear a lot about, Israel, Egypt. This is a little bit better map as far as all the local surroundings, right? We have Tel Aviv and so on, which we hear about in the news, and Hebron is sitting right there, a nice little pocket, Gaza Strip over here. So we have Israel here, Jordan here, and much of the conflict, right, is throughout these two regions here. So I found this interesting shot, free Hebron. So this is where much of the conflict is, but it's amazing that this was the first place in which David established his first capital. Later than Jerusalem, but nonetheless this was a key place in the history of the nation of Israel. And it still is, and as far as they're concerned, right? The conflict that goes on there. Which is amazing, you know, my father reminding us that all the world is going to rise up against them. So this is the route of the spies as they come from Kadesh Barnea, move up through the Negev. They're going to head up into the northern region, up to Lebo Hamath, and they're going to loop back around and come back in, and they're going to come back and they're going to give their report in verses 25 through 33. They're afraid, right? They talk about the descendants of Anak are there and so on. These are these great giants. Look, we can't go in here. We can't take these people. You have no idea. We have reference again in verse 33 of chapter 13. There's also, we saw the Nephilim. The sons of Anak are a part of the Nephilim. And we became like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we were in their sight. So therefore, they looked at land, they looked at these individuals, and they said, look, we can't, there's just no way we can do this, right? And so they doubted God's power. So they already complained against God's provision. They complained against God's prophet. Now they're going to complain against God's power, that God is not capable of taking them in there and conquering the land. And again, this is one of the reasons why I don't believe the Nephilim are the outcome of the sons of God and the daughters of men. It's the only other place and we have reference to them. And the term means to fall upon, but it's not in reference to their having fallen as in like man's fall or Satan's fall. It has to do with them being conquerors, if you will, or warriors. And so I think the men of renown are the outcome of that relationship of sons of God and daughters of men. But the Nephilim, it's a parenthetical. Yeah, the Nephilim, it's basically in Genesis, to me, it's a parenthetical statement. It's just making reference that they were there in those days, but the men of renown were the product of the sons of God and the daughters of men. So I think the Nephilim were just human beings, but they were extraordinary human beings. The response of the people, chapter 14, verses 1 through 10a. Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, would that we have died in the land of Egypt, or would that we have died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Or our wives or our little children or our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? It's just, right, that thing. Just let's go back to slavery. Let's just go back to slavery, you know. Let's go back to the good old days. So the people are going to complain. And if you read through chapter 14, notice the different references that are made in reference to their complaining. The first is they rebelled against the Lord, chapter 14, verse 9. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they will be our prey. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. So essentially, they were just questioning God's power and His ability to deliver them. They grumbled against the Lord, 14:27, 29:36. They rejected the land, which was tantamount to rejecting the covenant in 14:31. They refused to go in and take possession of the land that was a part of the Abrahamic covenant. So therefore, it was essentially rejecting the covenant that God had established for them long before in their ancestor Abraham. They turned away from the Lord, 14:43. They questioned the purpose of God, 14:3, right? Why would you bring us up to this place? They rejected God's appointed leader in 14:4, and they, in the end, are going to have their foolish wish granted. Would it be that we should die in this wilderness? God says, okay. Okay. That's exactly what's going to happen. Now, it's interesting because Moses is going to plead for the people in chapter 14, verse 11 and following. God's not going to take them immediately, but God is going to still judge them nonetheless. And so their punishment is that they're going to wander for 40 years in the wilderness until they all die off. The reaction of the Lord comes in chapter 14, verses 10 and 12. But all the congregation said to stone them with stones, and then the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent of meeting to all the sons of Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people spurn me, and how long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst? It's interesting because Ian and I have been going through the Gospel of Mark together, and it's interesting how the Gospel of Mark begins with these miracles that take place, and then later you're going to have the Pharisees come and ask Jesus for this great sign from heaven, and he's like, I'm not going to give it to you. Right? I've already given you all of these signs. You've already seen enough to draw the conclusion that the kingdom of God is at hand, the power is here, and I am the Messiah. And unless, the same with the Old Testament, right? They just learned from their fathers. Old Testament, God has so shown his power and ability to them, and yet they still. But it's interesting because we can sort of, look at them and say, come on now, really? But again, we do the same things in our own life, don't we? Right? Over and over we question God, we can complain against God and all that happens in our life. And over, he's just saying, look, I've been there, I've been there, I've been there, I'm still going to be there. So Moses' response comes in 14, 13 through 19. He's going to plead for them. He's going to appeal, if you will, to God and his glory and so on. He's going to appeal to the covenant. And God is he's not going to judge them immediately, but he is going to judge them. They're going to die off the land. But it's interesting because in chapter 15, we have this series of laws that are given, laws for Canaan. It's interesting because this is for when they enter into the land. And so to me, it's like this is such a message of hope, really, to the next generation. Now, you've been judged by God. You're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. You're all going to die off. But guess what? I'm giving you instruction for the land because I'm expecting that the second generation is going to go in and take over the land. And so essentially that is what we end up having, is the second generation is going to go in and take possession of the land of promise. But again, we have complaint. Korah's rebellion, chapter 16, blindness towards God's priests. We have blindness towards God's provision, blindness towards God's prophet, blindness towards God's power, and now blindness towards God's priest. Now Korah and the sons of Issachar, the son of Korah, the son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, and the sons of Eliab, on the son of Pelah, sons of Reuben, took action. And they rose up before Moses together with some of the sons of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, chosen assemblymen of renown. And they assembled themselves together against Moses and Aaron. They said to them, you have gone far enough, for all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is in their midst. So why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? So therefore, right, we have another instance of complaint, and there's going to come judgment, right? And God's going to deal with them. We find this again reflected in Psalms. It's interesting how many Psalms are just historical Psalms. Go back and just pick up on all of these events that take place. But that's not going to end there, because we're going to have in chapter 16, verse 41, as the NASB nicely puts, caption and title for us, murmuring and the plague. The next day, all the congregation, the sons of Israel, grumbled against Moses and Aaron, saying, you are the ones who have caused the death of the Lord's people. So you have this uprising of Korah, you have God's judgment, another uprising, another complaint, another judgment's going to come. But all the way through there, we are going to have the affirmation of the priesthood. So in chapter 17 and 18, we have Aaron's rod buds, which we all know the story, and then the duties of the Levites. And so God is going to affirm the fact that Aaron is the one. These are my leaders. Leave them alone. I've chosen them to lead you, and therefore you need to just step off. And we have the cleansing of dead bodies in chapter 19. And this is important because we have the ordinance of the red heifer. Reason being is that you're going to have the whole generation is going to die off in the wilderness. So you're going to have 1.2 million people drop dead in the wilderness, and they have to deal with all the corpses. There needs to be cleansing and purification. So therefore, that is what chapter 19 is. Again, this is how to deal with the uncleanness in the midst of the wilderness wanderings. And there isn't much really, and as far as the 40 years in the wandering that have been recorded for us in Numbers, there's a lot of stuff that we don't have. but enough to see that they just remained in their rebelliousness. Notice in chapter 20, verses 1 through 29, we have more rebellion. We have the death of Miriam. We have complaint and provision, leaders judged. This again, we also have the water of Meribah, and then we have the death of Aaron also in chapter 20. So in between the death of Miriam and the death of Aaron, we have the water of Meribah. But again, over and over, we just see this constant complaining, and then the judgment of God in dealing with this. Which again is a stark contrast, and this is why I wanted to do that when we started into Numbers, is to look at all the references that we had in the first few chapters, of which God speaks to Moses, Moses speaks to the people, and then Moses and the people are obedient to God. And we have all of these references to their obedience as God is ordering them and preparing them to depart from Sinai to head over to the promised land to take it over. And then all of a sudden the movement begins, and then we just see nothing but complaint, attack against God, attack against his leadership, and so on. We find again also in 21, we also have the complaint, judgment, blindness towards God's provision of manna in 21. And we have, this is the story we all know well, right? The bronze serpent. So what happened with the bronze serpent? This is a well-known story. We all should be able to recount this. And this is picked up in the New Testament, right, and reflective of Christ, right, on the cross. But what happened with the issue of the bronze serpent? Someone give us a nice little brief historical sketch of it. We have the context in verse 4 and following. And when they had set out from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the people became impatient because of the journey, the people spoke against God and Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food, no water. We loathe this miserable food. Verse 6, and the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. They bit the people so that many people died. So God instructed, right, Moses. Then the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent. Verse 8, set it on a standard, and it shall come about that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, he will live. All right, so God gave his judgment upon their complaining, the fiery serpents, but he also gave them a remedy. And Moses takes his fiery serpent and makes his sculpture of it, if you will, puts it on the standard and lifts it up. Those who were bitten, if they look at it, they would live, but those who did not would perish.
It's kind of funny that that emblem's still on the ambulances today.
That's true. It's amazing how much stuff we get from the Bible when we realize it, right? Phrases, symbols. So over and over, starting in chapter 11, verse 1, we just see this constant refrain of a complaint and the judgment by God. Complaint, judgment, complaint, judgment. This is important to see, because when we get to chapter 22, we have Balak sins for Balaam, right? So starting in chapter 22, verse 1, then the sons of Israel journeyed, and they camped in the plains of Moab beyond the Jordan opposite Jericho. Now Balak the son of Zippor saw that Israel had done to the Amorites, and so Moab was in great fear because of the people, for they were numerous. And Moab was in dread of the sons of Israel. So Moab said to the elders of Midian, now this horde will lick up all that is around us, like the ox licks up the grass of the field. And Balak the son of Zippor was the king of Moab at that time. So you're going to send for Balaam, son of Beor, right? And they're going to ask him to come, and they're going to ask him to do what? Curse Israel. And he was a pagan prophet. Now what's interesting is this is such a strange encounter and happening, right? Because God's actually going to speak through this pagan prophet. He's actually going to make his will known to him. He's going to communicate to him. He's actually going to see, right, the angel, although the donkey sees it first. And I love that, donkey's like, dude, what are you doing, man? Haven't I served you faithfully all these years? What are you whipping me for? Don't you see the angel in the middle of the road? So we have this great encounter, but we have to see this progression that happens, though. Okay? We have to see this complaint over and over and how their attitude was towards God moving up to this moment. Why? Because they're not even in this encounter. We don't hear anything from the voice of the people. It's just between Balaam, Balak, and God. And really it's just between Balaam and God. And all the way through this encounter, we see God being faithful to his people and his covenant. He will not allow him to curse them. He will only allow him to bless them, and that is it. So all the while they are being unfaithful, God is showing himself to be faithful behind the scenes of something that they probably were not even aware was going on. Right? It's such an amazing truth, but if we don't see the overall progression of the context, we just miss the punch here of God's faithfulness in the midst of their unfaithfulness. And really, that is what we have in the series of episodes that come here. We have the blessing of Israel through Balaam, 21:1 through 24:25. We have the plight of Moab, the invitation to Balaam to come and curse them, the journey of Balaam, and then we have the oracles. So we have the preparation for the oracles that come in 22:36 through 23:6, and then we have the series of oracles, and then the final one giving in 24:20 through 25. And you can read through those, but again, the overall fact is that God would not allow him to curse them, only to bless them. And again, God's faithfulness in the midst of their unfaithfulness to him. And again, it creates such a striking contrast too when we come to chapter 25, because we have the final failure, if you will, of the first generation that comes in 25:1 and following. Notice with me, this is the sin of Peor. And while Israel remained at Shittim, the people began to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab, for they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel joined themselves to Baal Peor, and the Lord was angry against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the fierce anger of the Lord will turn away from Israel. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you slay his men who has joined themselves to Baal Peor. This is not a good moment. And this is the last, if you will, in a long series of moments of failure and faithlessness on the part of the people. Those who died as a result of a plague, verse 9, which came, those who died by the plague were 24,000. 24,000 died. But it's interesting because we have a stark contrast with Phinehas, and we'll hear from him later, and see God's covenant with him in this passage. But notice with me, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned away my wrath from the sons of Israel, and that he is jealous with my jealousy among them, so that it did not destroy the sons of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, behold, I will give him my covenant of peace, and it shall be for him and his descendants after him, and a covenant of perpetual priesthood, because of the jealous for his God, and made atonement for the sons of Israel. Because of this, Phinehas and his line, which is going to be the line of Zadok, they are going to be the priests in the millennial kingdom. We will see a transition that happens within the priestly line, if you will. We have Eli and his sons are going to die in 1 Samuel. We're going to see a transition that happens. Both lines are going to serve during the time of David, but in Solomon, finally, it's going to be completely over into the line of Zadok, and they are going to be the priests in the millennial kingdom. But again, it's interesting to see how God makes this covenant, but then to watch the unfolding of that. It isn't as though all of a sudden, instantaneous, God makes the covenant and all of a sudden then the priesthood just is from that line and that's it and it's immediate. No, we see God work it out over time as the history of the nation continues on. But again, the stark contrast that happens, not just in 25, between the sin of the people and the zeal of Phinehas, but also between the complaint of the people and also then the faithfulness of God in chapter 21:1 through 24:25. And then we have the experience of the second generation of the plains of Moab. Starting in chapter 26, verse 1, here we have the census of the new generation that takes place. Again, the ordering of the men needed for war and so on. So we're going to have another census taken. Again, God's going to go through the process of preparing them for the conquest of the land in 26:1 through 32:42. So we have, if you will, following that flow of thought, order, right? Disorder. We can see that disorder clearly from 11 all the way through 25. And now we're reordering, if you will, the people and getting them ready to go into the land. we're going to find them, if you will, on the east side of the Jordan River, in which they're going to head in. So essentially we come to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is much like Leviticus. They don't move. There's no historical movement. Deuteronomy are 3 sermons that are going to be given to the next generation, new generation, sitting on the east side of the Jordan River, ready to go into the promised land, to take it over under the leadership of Joshua, because God's not going to let Moses go in. Why? Right? Because he didn't give God the glory when he struck the rock. So Moses is going to give the 3 sermons. They're not going to move. They're going to stay in one geographical location, just like Leviticus. So that's why Leviticus and Deuteronomy are considered, really, in the progression of the Old Testament narrative, they're considered to be complementary books. There isn't any movement of narrative, right? The key 11 books, we have clear movement of narrative that happens. Genesis, Exodus, and so on, Numbers, Joshua, Judges. And so that's why we focus on those ones, but these complementary ones are crucial. So we have the review of the journey of the wilderness in chapter 33. Moses is going to go back and recount. You know, that's an interesting thing and fascinating. I read an ETS, Evangelical Theological Society. There was an Old Testament scholar. He had written a paper on worship from the Old Testament. What was fascinating to me was because he went through the Psalms and he wanted to show how much or how often the focus was on remembering. And that's essentially what Moses is going to do with the nation of Israel, this new generation. He's going to challenge them to remember. And he's going to recount the things that God had done for them. That's why Deuteronomy, it's an appropriate title, the Book of Remembrance, because he's going to go through and say, remember, 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 remember. Right? Build off the past in a positive way, not in a negative way, right? In a way of obedience, not disobedience. Also, when you read through Deuteronomy, you'll just make a mental note how many times you see the word obedience in Deuteronomy. Key word. The anticipation then of the conquest of the land, 33:50 through 36:13. So again, Moses is going to get them ready, and he is going to then give the 3 sermons, past, present, future, in Deuteronomy as he gets them set to enter into the land. So we are going to find them on the east side of the Jordan River, ready to head in. The first battle is going to be the Battle of Jericho. This is going to be the strike at the heart, if you will. And it's going to be God's battle, and it's going to be done God's way, because God wants them to understand this is my warfare, my holy warfare, and I'm going to take you through it as so long as you do it my way, right? And this is get another sense too of Riblah and Lebo Hamath, how far up the spies had traveled through the land, so they had a good sense of what was going on there. If we look at Numbers, just the progression, the movement that happens here, we have the generation who came out of Egypt, we have the new generation. Essentially, we're talking about those who were born in Egypt, the young ones, right? Children, teens, had experienced the Exodus. They're going to outlive their parents, the first generation. The first generation is going to die off. They're now going to be in their 40s, except for Joshua and Caleb are the only ones who are going to be older, really, because right? They're the only ones who are not going to die off in the wilderness wanderings because they were obedient. But then we're going to have, if you will, the preparation that comes, organization, consecration. This begins the beginning of Numbers, instruction. This is out Mount Sinai. And then we're going to have, if you will, the test that comes, the test of faith, of obedience, Kadesh Barnea. The spies are going to be sent in. The judgment is going to come because they rejected the power of God. And so therefore God is going to punish them with wandering for 40 years in the wilderness. And then we have, if you will, the reorganization of the new generation, the repair in the plains of Moab. And this is where we find the book of Deuteronomy. The next generation ready, if you will, at the threshold of entering into the land of promise. So next week we'll come back and look at Deuteronomy, walk through it. One of the things we want to highlight there, and the reason why we're going to stop and look at Deuteronomy is because of the extension of the Abrahamic covenant given in Genesis 12. And we'll find a series of episodes in which it's been expounded on. We've already seen it in Genesis, right? Because the covenant was essentially given in Genesis chapter 12. Then we have it ratified in chapter 15, then affirmed in chapter 17. But we also see, again, it affirmed in chapter 13 in between those. And so all along the way we see God affirming that covenant that he made, but we'll see a crucial aspect when we come to Deuteronomy.